When I was in kindergarten, I told my teacher I wanted to sing a song for the class. She said, "Of course, go ahead, Danielle." And so I jumped up onto a chair and began to belt, "I am a woman, hear me roar, in numbers too big to ignore, and I know too much to go back and pretend." I wish I could remember the look on my teacher's face after my performance. She called my mother, explaining that she was expecting a Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and instead got a full-on, child-size, Helen Reddy performance. My mother called my grandmother, who had been teaching me the words to that song for weeks. I imagine this tells you a lot about me, how I grew up, that self-confidence and belief that women could and would and should do anything and everything possible. The sky is the limit, hear me roar. This is the story I love to tell. And years and years and years later, the harder story. I was in seminary at Boston University School of Theology, and I felt like I couldn't recognize myself anymore. My roar, it was gone. Where was my roar? I was anxious and even scared all the time. I found that I didn't want to speak in class. I didn't want to share my story because of the mental and emotional spiraling. In my head, I would hear, "If you speak, they will realize you aren't smart enough to be here. They will know, they will figure it out that you don't belong." It became easier to sit in silence and be lost in the ever-deepening spiral after. I needed help. I needed tools and support. I couldn't do it all on my own after all. I imagine this tells you a lot about me. Sometimes I get lost in self-doubt. Sometimes the imposter syndrome, they are going to figure me out becomes unbearable. I know that I need support and help. This is the story I don't love to tell. From our reading this morning, in the darkest night, when our hearts are breaking, love embraces us, even when we cannot embrace ourselves. Love saves us and redirects us towards generosity. The anguish is this: violence can break our hearts and efface the sacred goodness of life in this world. The hope is this: love in its myriad of forms can recall us to life. This is something, Olympia Brown, Unitarian Universalist Church, that you have thought about. You included this in your mission statement. Our church is a community of hope, challenging us to transform ourselves, promote love and justice, respect all faiths, and shepherd our planet. I want to take a moment to think about the word love. What is your shared communal understanding of love? Right? So think for a moment. What does love mean to you? What does love for Obuck look like, feel like? If you were to put love in a box, what would you put in? So think about that for a second. What is love? I imagine for everyone that there are similar and still beautifully unique answers for everyone in this space. In a famous analogy, linguist Ludwig Wittgenstein explains this process of creating shared meaning. He writes that 4 people each have a box, and in that box is what each person would call a beetle. They cannot see in each other's boxes. How do they know what each would call a beetle? The argument is that they can't know. They can't truly know what each other call a beetle. But as Reverend David Breeden explains, but what we can do is listen to what others say about what they call beetle, and we can share what we mean by beetle, and in this communal sharing, something approximating a definition of a beetle begins to exist in community. If we think back to our answers, what is love? What did we put into our box? Perhaps some would have said chicken noodle soup. Others would have protest signs. Others would have phones and pens used to call congresspeople or write letters to loved ones. Others might have something to symbolize an ear for listening. Maybe a chalice for the larger love that holds us all. The love that held our early Universalist ancestors and that I believe holds us still. When we talk about love, we create a shared meaning, a shared understanding of love in action, and what that looks like. When we talk about love, we create a shared meaning, a shared understanding of love in action, and what that looks like. What love is uniquely yours, oh Buck? What love is uniquely yours? And I know that the love that is uniquely yours was inspired and influenced by those early Universalists. That fact is in your name, Olympia Brown. The kind of love that Reverend Parker shared in our reading this morning is inspired by those early Universalists. It is the love we are called to. It is the love preached and made popular by early Universalist minister Hosea Ballou. A belief that all are saved by the universal love of God. And we are invited to live in a way that affirms this gift. Reverend Parker explains, quote, a universalist ethic unfolds from this theology. Since all are loved by God, we are called to love all, to devote our lives to justice, mercy, and compassion. This is the story I love to tell about Universalism, a belief in a God so loving that no one is outside that love. No one is beyond its reach. No one is left outside the circle of love. And it is our role to live that love in relationships, in all that we do, to affirm that gift. That is the story I love to tell. Reverend Parker continues, the harder story. The faith of Universalism is fragile because it is continually assaulted by life experiences that teach us to doubt. Our own life experiences of tragedy or violence, as well as our awareness of what is happening now. It forces us to confront a magnitude of evil that makes it hard to trust that all are saved. The most obvious thing is not that we are all saved. The most obvious thing is that the world is full of brokenness, suffering, and injustice. This is the story I don't love to tell about Universalism. It feels good to say that all are held in love. It feels right to believe that no one is outside that circle of love. And how do our own experiences of suffering and tragedy, of heartbreak, the evils in our world, they test this belief. It is hard to trust that all are saved by this love. The hope is this: love in its myriad of forms can recall us to life. This is an incomplete story of universalism. There is much to say, and still, in this quick summary, how does this story, this belief in a larger love that is available to all, which holds us in our joys and our sorrows and our heartbreak, what does it offer us in this moment? What does it offer us in this community, in this church? From her book, After the Good News, Reverend Nancy MacDonald Ladd quotes Reverend Robert Eller Isaacs, who says, "The primary purpose of the church in the world, an encounter that changes us and gives us a fighting chance of being renewed by our living rather than just enduring it." Does the promise of love in our successes renew us? Does the promise of love when we win renew us? Does the promise of love showing up when we did the right thing, when we bring the best of ourselves, the best of our lives, does that renew us? Maybe? Yes? Sometimes? Or the promise of love when we fall short, the promise of love when we make a mistake, the promise of love when our hearts are breaking, the promise of love when we show up with all of our imperfection, when we share those stories, when we hear each other. Is that when we are renewed? Maybe, yes, sometimes. We're going to spend some more time with this next week, but I wanted to bring in a little bit this morning, a little bit of Reverend Sean Parker Dennison's Berry Street lecture. This is from General Assembly in 2015. It's Why Failure is Not an Option. He writes, quote, "There's something in a sermon a few years ago that I have not forgotten." He said, "One mistake we often make is trying to lead with our strengths rather than our heartbreak. We need to counter the culture of purity and perfectionism with a universalist theology of love and with new practices that teach us that we will not be rejected, but we can find our way back when we fail." And this is a practice that I believe you all have already started with your Right Relations Covenant. The beginning, right? It reads, it formalizes our expectations of treating one another as we want to be treated. Being human and not perfect, we recognize that while we will strive to uphold the elements of the covenant, we will sometimes fail. When that happens, we will refer to this covenant to help set us back on the right path, a reminder of our shared vision. What is the story you love to tell? What is the story you don't love to tell about Olympia Brown Unitarian Universalist Church? Using my own example, what I have learned through time in therapy and processing with friends and loved ones is that there are not two separate Rev Danielles. These stories aren't examples of Rev Danielle at her best and Rev Danielle at her worst, right? It's more intricate, it's more complicated than that. It is moments of forward movement, of belief and energy, and it is moments of self-doubt, of discouragement, of anxiety and fear, and sometimes they happen at the same time, right? What is right causes doubt. What is needed isn't comfortable. The rhino who swallowed the storm is only half the story. The rhino who swallowed the storm found himself lost lonely in such a dark place, but then his friends threw down a rope. Life would bring changes, beginnings and ends, but he had faith in himself and faith in his friends. As they curled up together, he felt love and protected. And he dreamed of a world that was safe and connected. He understood now it was love that mattered. If here we have a love that embraces us as we try, as we fail, when we swallow the entire storm, when we hear the entirety of our stories, when we are trusted to hear the entirety of the stories of one another, when we lead with our heartbreak, when we live our lives as an affirmation of this love, of this gift, when we live our lives in trust of this love, what becomes possible? What is possible? A question to hold together as we enter this week of candidating, this week of sharing and hearing stories, of inviting one another into and onto a shared sacred journey. And there is one truth that I am certain. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Meaning we keep going. Whoa, yeah, yeah. May it be so. Amen and blessed be.